Actually, you don't have to love them, but I was just considering, what to talk about today. And a few people have brought to me just different triggers that they've had. And as I've sat around a few days and watched them look at those triggers with KI, almost inevitably what happens is a new clarity comes. So they'll share with me, like, oh, that was perfect because then I got to see this program that I have, this story, and then I inquired into that, and now I see things differently. So triggers really are um, a doorway into insight and clarity. And that's true of almost really all of them. And yet they hurt like hell, right? They hurt. And so we don't like them because they're painful. But wow, do they open us up. And without the triggers, where would freedom be? What would be the point of talking about this work if the triggers weren't there? So the triggers really are the doorway to heaven, and it's the triggers or the upset, are the reason that we come to work like this, suffering. So it's a strange loop um, that we can't, if we didn't have the triggers, we wouldn't have this work. Of course, we wouldn't need it then, I suppose. um, so one topic that came in, and I definitely want to paraphrase this because it was a very long email. Essentially, someone just really went off on someone in their life, got really angry with the person, and they said it felt justified because of some stuff that had happened. But before, they never would have been able to get angry. And they would have kept it in, person said, and it would have festered. And they would have come to resent the person, but they never would have actually said it. And they said they've been amazed at how, email it was explaining how he was amazed at how he was so quick to get angry now, but also quick to resolve it. So let's talk about that. This is someone who's been doing a lot of the repression work that we have here. This person's been doing that work. So I'm just trying to feel into that in my own experience. Um, Quicker to anger and quicker to resolve it. So essentially, the person was emailing me because they felt so liberated in the sense that they were able to say something very directly to someone that really upset them. And they really laid into the person and didn't hold back. And they were commenting about how afterwards it didn't feel like they did anything wrong. Like they felt as if it was clean, that it needed to be said. And even though it was uncomfortable and painful, there was no shame over it. And so, yes, I can relate to that because many of us spend our whole lifetime afraid, right? Like, let's be honest here. Afraid to be ourselves, afraid to take someone to task because of, for whatever reason. Even when we are angry, even when we're upset, even when we have something to say, remaining in fear. And I think when there's anger repression, one doesn't truly recognize the degree of fear that operates in your life until you come out of repression. I've come out of repression. So it's like Monday morning quarterbacking. I can see the fear that was running my life. Now, this is not fear that's conscious. It's very, very deeply unconscious. It's what holds it's programs in the mind, essentially, that holds energy back, holds it back, holds on to it. Because to let the energy go, to free it, to get angry, to speak up would be, well, threatening. So threatening that many people don't ever really do it. So there's people are reporting now that they are speaking more spontaneously, coming out of repression. The question this gentleman had is that, you know, he finds himself being able to get angrier quicker. He didn't say more often. So let's talk about quicker to anger. When you're repressing anger, I don't know this person's situation exactly, but let me just share my own experience. When you're repressing anger, you're slow to get to the place where there's real anger. It's like a slow process. And there's a lot of fear and resistance to even being angry, right? Or to putting the or really being overtly angry. So there's a lot in the conditioning that slows that down and makes sure there's a lot in the conditioning that makes sure that it won't happen, first of all, that it doesn't happen. And that if it does, it's really slow coming to anger for some people who are repressed. And it's exactly how it was for me. That's the repression too. It's like some people who are repressed can be in the face of someone saying awful things or doing something awful, and it takes a while for the person even to respond, especially once they come to spirituality. Then they think that any response other than, is that so? Or anything other than a peaceful response isn't allowed. So, again, bringing this up again, this problem in spirituality where people are already coming to it who are repressed, who are slow to express their true emotions about something, or who aren't expressing their true emotions about something, repressed. And then you hear this message like, if you get triggered, that's the ego. So I'm going to be the one over here saying this over and over again. And you all will probably get tired of me saying it. But I'm going to keep saying this because it's a lot like I meet people every day or I talk to people, and then they'll say to me, Scott, I know exactly what you're saying. I can't access anger. And in fact, when I came to spirituality, it solidified it. So I learned when I got to spirituality, I just talked to someone last night who said this. I said, where did the peacemaker uh, ego first get created in your life? And at first he said, you know what? A lot of it was when I entered spirituality. Now he was able to tie it to go back to that because I think with repression, it definitely starts earlier. But he's an example of the kind of thing that I've said is probably out there very, very commonly. So just look at you and your friends, see if you're here, which is people who are already have a tendency to repress or suppress emotion or thoughts, hold back, hold on, hold back, don't, that kind of thing, like don't rock the boat, don't say this. That personality comes into spirituality and repression can become institutionalized almost. I don't know how else to say it. Institutionalized meaning it's like when you walk in the door of the enlightenment or the non-dual teachings, you can very easily get the message that your emotions, especially the ones like anger and the more turbulent ones, are not allowed here, and that they are ego, and that if they come out, you're coming from ego. It feels like a bit like the people who rescue the people who are in cults. Okay, now let me clarify this. It's like there's a process of letting someone know when they're in an organization. For example, that they're in an organization they're in a mindset that's very unhealthy for them, right? You're in a cult. So I'm trying to tell you that you're in a cult and this bad things are happening to you. And I'm trying to convince you the clarity of seeing that you're in a cult and that you're on this destructive path and you can't see it. And the whole cult believes it. And I'm trying to get you away from it so that you can not be damaged by it anymore. Now, spirituality and non-duality is not a cult, and I'm not making that comparison in the strict sense, but I am saying that it's like that when people wake up out of this. So, and I don't mean spiritual awakening like non-dual awakening. I mean literally woke, more like the way that that word is used in our culture is to wake up to something, to a fact, to something that you're doing, believing, um, that you may not recognize as harmful or damaging or limiting to you. So it is like that, where it's like people are in spirituality and non duality and they're not aware of how there's like an institutionalized repression. So it's very subtle but pervasive. It's subtle but pervasive. So it's not like when you go walk in the door of a satsang that you get a card that says you're not allowed to get angry. You're not allowed to show this emotion, or to say this. You're not allowed. You don't get that card. You don't. There's no manual that says you can't do this, you can't do that. But subtly, the language and the atmosphere of some of the teachings are that, again, it's how we phrase things. That there's, if someone's angry, well, they're just an ego, or they still believe in a self, or and things like there is no such thing as repression. That's it's self represses, has nothing to do with presence. This kind of talk that dismisses this mechanism of repression. So then it becomes like institutionalized. And so what I mean by that is that externally it's being reinforced. Like when people go to prison, and some of the ways of acting and behaving are institutionalized. Like you come to act and behave and believe something in order to, because you're in an institution that reinforces it constantly. So when you're in spirituality and repression is being reinforced, sometimes you're the last to know. And that's why it's like talking to a cult member right there. Is it like you're the last to know? I was the last to know. It's like years went by being involved in these kinds of teachings, and anger was being repressed, and I was literally didn't know. And it was like waking up, like being woke to the fact of there's something is off here. Something is off, because how was I able to go this far into this by repressing anger? And not only why didn't nobody talk about it, but yeah, nobody talked about repression. The teachers, the teachings, the programs, the therapies that I was involved in, they didn't talk about it. And in fact, they did a disservice in the sense that the way that they talked made me think that my repression was spiritual. And not that they intended that, but that the way that they talked left me with an impression that the repression of anger, for example, or any turbulence, is a spiritual thing. That means I'm not an ego. So subtly, not so subtly reinforced. It was amazing to sit and talk to my friend the other day, because it was just like he was in a cult and recognized it in that moment, or had recognized it recently. He was like, when I said, when do you think that got created, that repression of anger? And he said, well, I don't, he said it was probably created before that, but when I got into spirituality, it was reinforced. And he said a big part of it was spirituality. Almost everyone, not everyone, I don't want to say that. Many people that come to this work will say that they're not repressing, or have the impression that they're not repressing emotion. Many people, not even necessarily the majority, but there's quite a few who have the assumption that they're not repressing. And this is part of the institutionalized thing. This is part of it. Is like, it's like when you're in a cult, you don't really recognize it. You really don't. It could be like right in front of your face and you don't see it. And in fact, everything in the cult kind of reinforces you not seeing it, because everybody's doing it, that kind of thing. And it's not unlike this with repression. It's like suddenly it's being reinforced. And if someone were to bring it up, like if somebody were to say to a cult member, you're in a cult, they would be like, no, this is just my home. This is my family. This is where I find truth. If you were to say something like that to someone who's repressing, hey, you're repressing, and the atmosphere, the community that you're in is reinforcing it, like a cult, and you can't see it, they'd be like, no, I don't think I am. I see that quite a lot, actually. And then I do the repression test, where we test out whether there's repression of anger and fear and shame. And quite often it's like, yes, repression, repression, repression. So there it is, almost like evidence of how indoctrinated we are into, I mean, really lulled into institutionalized repression. And we don't even know it. But then there can be this moment again where you stop and you recognize it literally stopping. And that's exactly what my friend did the other day. Stopping and recognizing the institutionalized repression. This is a real thing, guys. And when you get woke to it, you're really woke to it. Like you can't unwake yourself from that. It's like anything, it's like someone who wakes up in the midst of a cult, a belief system that's indoctrinated them a certain way. Once they wake up to it, they don't go back. They don't, well, once you woke to something, you're on the way out of that already. You're already on the way out once you begin to get woke to it. So it's not like you're going to like stuff it back down. You may for a while, like pretend like it's not there, try to rejoin the thinking, the institutionalized thinking, but it doesn't work once you become woke to it. And that's the point in time where people start to become interested in going down this rabbit hole of work related to pulling up everything they've been trying to hold down through all the years of living on earth and also being involved in spirituality. So the work hasn't even begun around repression until you wake up to it. It doesn't even begin. So now you know why I get on here all the time and get on my soapbox around it, because it's not a soapbox. It's about saying it. Nobody else is saying it. So I'm going to keep saying it because I know that there are people out there who are involved in the institutionalized, like they're completely indoctrinated into repressing through spirituality, and nobody's saying it to them. It's not like I see myself as a savior. It's not that. There's no identity in it. It's just keep talking, keep saying it, because when, I've already gone through the experience of, if you watch the television shows like where one person in a religious organization wakes up and defuncts, or not defuncts, but leaves. What's the word that I'm looking for? Anyway, leaves the organization. And then once they wake up to it, they want to help others. That's all that it is. The cult of spiritual repression, let's call it. Hmm. What's interesting is that there's a little bit of shadow that gets created for people. So, like, once they recognize they've been repressing and they start doing this work, it's like anything when you're leaving something that you were formerly really in, you can shadow box it, and in other words, that part of yourself that represses starts to become like, you don't like it because you recognize how much damage it's done. So that is a natural thing that I see happening for people. And they'll even take it so far as like now they're shadow boxing people who are repressed. And you have to watch for that. I have to watch for that. Instead of talking about people that are repressed and making a big deal out of that, I want to talk about repression generally, the institution of it, instead of shadow boxing. And what I mean is like it's not, if you're not careful, when you start doing repression work or anything, you'll look at other people who are repressed and you'll be bothered by them, is what I'm saying. Because you're bothered by that within yourself, right? So as you're recognizing it within yourself and working with that, it's an aspect of yourself that you disowned, right? That's the nature of repression. Not only are the thoughts and feelings repressed, but the very fact that you're repressing those things is repressed. completely shut out of your consciousness. So when you start to wake to it, then that's an aspect of yourself that you didn't know was there. And you're beginning now to include that and work through that. It's only natural then to look out in the world, and when you see someone else repressed, you you may get triggered. Some people do get triggered, and even, like, for example, don't want to be around people who are repressing. That happens. But after a while, that smooths itself over, and you recognize really you were just fighting yourself. It was a shadow. You kind of re-own that shadow, and but I'm just saying that that can happen, and that's not where I want people to hear this talk coming from. It's not that shadow boxing. It's I've already moved through that. It's more like what I said is wanting to help people who wake up to it, because if you wake up to it, if you start to notice that you repress, then what do you do with that information? There has to be some place to go to deal with that. And that's what we're creating here. There's a place for people to go to finally deal with this. And this is a sticky issue. I'll just tell you, it's been mind boggling to work with people in this new area. It's a completely different dimension of our work. And it brings forth a number of challenges that people really have never faced before in terms of resistance to lifting of repression. So it's really systemic. What I see is in the human being itself, there's been such a repression of these emotions, and then within our spiritual communities, there's a repression even of the issue. The entire issue is pushed down and not discussed. But as we talk about it, you and me, and those of us doing this work, that's contagious. So when you hang around your friends who are in Advaita or Buddhism or some spiritual program, and you just begin to talk in a way that isn't repressed anymore, and you talk about repression, it changes people and it affects people. And it's like spreading the love around. But there has to be a place to go, is what I mean. Well, it doesn't have to be. You could just learn that you're repressed and then do nothing with it. But here's the insidious thing is that people are learning that they've repressed, and then they go back to some of the practices that institutionalized the repression. So this is where it gets really insidious. So in other words, they picked up certain practices in the spiritual path within an institution that represses. And so therefore the practices repress. The practices don't honor the emotions fully sometimes, and they downplay them, dismiss them, you know, language it in such a way that if you have such an emotion, that that's ego. So it gets completely shut down and shut out of your experience. And then you've literally engaged. Now I don't know you, I'm just saying theoretically, you've engaged in practices within an institution that doesn't recognize repression. An institution could be your tradition, your teaching, even spirituality as a whole or non-duality as a whole. If I look back at it, I could say the subject of repression is repressed. So you're in an institution, and then the practices or the teachings within that, of course, would strengthen the repression because the repression isn't even recognized within the institution. So the practices, of course, could very well reinforce them. So then you wake up to it, you recognize, oh man, all my life I've been holding this down, holding this back. And then you go to the same practices. This is the insidious part. You go back to the same practices which strengthen the repression. And this is another part of the message that I really would like people to hear, because when you wake up to repression, it doesn't mean that you know how to undo that. If you knew how to undo that, assumingly you would have done, or you would assume, I would assume you would have done it already. And I didn't. because again, I was in an institution that had practices that reinforced the repression. So waking up to it is just that. It's just having insider knowledge. It's definitely doesn't mean that you have the skill to deal with it. So what I keep seeing then is people wake up to it and then they look within their own practices and they may not even recognize that their practices are designed to strengthen it. More frustration right there. So there's a process of recognizing repression is going on, and then there's a process of discerning which practices are most skillful to bring that up. And then which practices are strengthening the repression. That becomes part of the discernment for everyone. Now that I think back at it, everyone that comes into this repression dimension of our work goes through that process of looking at their practice and their lifestyle and the atmosphere that they live in. And does it strengthen repression? Is it conducive to coming out of repression? And if not, where are the practices? Where is the environment that's conducive for that? Let me address the question that the person had. It's like that he says he's quicker to anger now. Quicker to anger means if anger is there, it's accessible. So when you're repressing, you're slow to anger. Is he left that out? I just didn't understand it. Maybe that back when he was repressed, the fuse for anger was longer. So think about it. You light a fuse when you're angry. It's a long fuse because you sit there and you fester with it, and you may not even acknowledge it to yourself fully. And so then you may not even acknowledge it, your anger towards someone else fully. And the fuse remains long because in repressing it and not acknowledging it, it builds and builds and builds. And so not only are you slower to anger when you're repressed, but when it comes out, it can be volcanic, eruptive. And I learned that is that so when I was repressed, again, I was slow to anger, slow to respond with anger. And then when I responded with anger, the outbursts were stronger because they were like volcanic eruptions and they were very rare, like a long period in between. And I used to say things like, well, that's just because, the work that I've done, apparently the anger just doesn't arise very much. That's how much the institutionalized repression had fooled me into thinking, into believing that there wasn't repression there. So look for these signs. Are you slow to anger? Meaning, does it take you a while to say what you need to say to someone, or to get upset, visibly upset with someone, or to show emotion? Is it either impossible or are you very slow to it, as if it's really challenging to emote in that way freely? Because there you're going to have a long fuse, and that's where the festering is. Now, when you come out of repression, there's a short fuse, but it's not as big of an outburst. That's what I've learned about my own experience. You see, when there's a long fuse and you're festering because you're repressing, you're trying to hold back. It's like a volcano. If you hold that lava back, you keep holding it back, eventually it's going to have to explode. But when there's no repression, there's nothing holding the lava in. This is a bad metaphor, but you know what I mean. It gets to spew forth. And it's not necessarily anger every time, it's just directness sometimes. It's just saying, I really don't want you to do that. I prefer you don't do that. Or speaking your mind spontaneously and not shutting down all the time. And so by speaking spontaneously and being more authentically yourself all along the way, the fuse, the festering isn't happening. So you may be quick to respond because you're not repressed, but then the response isn't a complete outburst of ferocious anger because you haven't been holding it in. freedom, can we just say that that's what freedom is? It is not freedom to be holding on to a trigger and repressing it and not being able to express it or acknowledge it. That isn't freedom. That feels like bondage now that I look back. Anger is a primary emotion. There's no way that we can keep it from coming up. Well, I should say that there's no way to literally keep it from affecting our lives. We have to make room for it in our experience. It's one of the guests that Rumi talks about, like welcome every guest, thought, feeling, sensation. He didn't say welcome every guest except anger. Keep anger away. So there's nothing we can do about it. It's a primary emotion. If it's arising, to fully allow it and to see the stories around it, to fully allow it doesn't mean put it on someone, but at least to fully allow it would be freedom, whereas holding it back would be ego. Now, people have said that no, it's ego to express anger. As if every time you're expressing anger, that's just pure ego, and that is not the case. Somehow we've learned it though, like all anger is ego. Of course, not everybody thinks that, but that party line does get repeated in a way. So we have to make room for anger as a primary emotion, a part of our experience. It's a welcome guest. And then let's just look at it, how we're relating to it, instead of saying that whenever there's ego, it's automatically ego, or whenever there's anger, it's automatically ego. Can we look and see what's really happening with anger? Because it occurs to me that, yeah, if I'm just getting upset overtly all the time, then I must be believing something, and that's ego, right? But if I'm holding back, holding back, holding back, holding back the anger, that's equally ego. To me, there's no difference. You can have ego at either one of those. In other words, identity around either one of those. But what if there really isn't a strong identity around anger at a certain point? What if there's no repression, which is an identification? Repressing is like, I have to stay safe. I need people to like me. I need to please them. I don't want to upset them. Ego. If that's not there, and if anger comes up and there aren't a lot of strong stories with it, it's just like in the moment, spontaneous, coming up to meet a situation and then falling away. That to me feels healthier. That kind of relationship to anger that doesn't try to dismiss it or pretend like it's not there, but also doesn't repress it, but also doesn't identify with it when it comes through. Just allowing it to come through freely in awareness and not judging it anymore, not feeling ashamed anymore because anger came up. So, what clean anger feels like to me is when it comes up to meet a situation in which it's appropriate to energy meets energy. So, if someone's upset or doing something, the anger that comes up to meet that energy is not necessarily ego, it's just energy that comes to match energy. And it could be very effective, actually. And it can be very ineffective if you can't access it, is what I've found. Can't access it. Your communications on the whole may be suffering, like a lack of directness, a lack of clarity in what you're saying and what you're asking for, your needs, the boundaries that you set. All of that could be skewed because of the repression of anger. It was for me. All of that was skewed to a certain degree. The capacity to speak up, to say what I want, my needs, my boundaries. And there was even a little bit of like, you should feel bad about that in spirituality. Like, your needs, your wants, boundaries. Well, there is no self, it's all one. Why would you care about your needs, your boundaries, your wants? Because all of my life I've been repressing those things. That's why. Maybe that's a good reason, because I've literally spent a lifetime repressing my voice about what I want and what I need and my boundaries. And that is my ego, is a repression. So the ego that you're talking about is something that I don't even know. I'm not aware of an ego that goes around selfishly wanting and needing and and setting boundaries everywhere. Like that is not my experience of life, to have that kind of ego. There may be people who have that kind of ego activity where the work that they have to do is not repression work. It's that their anger, they're identified with it, and they've got lots of self-centered needs and wants, and they're stuck in that. But that is not that is not what it's like for a repressed ego. We don't have a history of asking for what we want and what we need. We don't have a history of setting boundaries. When we look back at our past, we might see relationships where there weren't any boundaries or very little boundaries. There's relationships where we really wanted something but never spoke up and said it. So we have a completely different experience of ego than others. Than the way that it's sometimes said in spirituality is that ego is always this thing that just is self-centered and wants and needs. And so maybe if nothing else, these conversations will illuminate this kind of ego that has gotten a get out of jail free card the whole time. The peacemaker, people pleasing, acquiescing ego comes into spirituality and it just blends right in. It's like, yeah, you're welcome here. Come on in. Because you're not rocking the boat. You're sitting over there quietly. You're being a good little student who doesn't act up. You just keep the peace over there. All these people have been welcomed into spirituality who have institution or who have deep repression, and they're welcome and rewarded. Like, come on in. And then we just go right into it blindly, further strengthening repression and then not knowing that we're doing it. And maybe even following a teacher that encourages it, maybe even indirectly encourages it. And then as we become interested in repression work, we sometimes have to deal with how our conditioning then wants to do the repression work. So someone recognizes that there's anger repression, for example, and then they'll say, well, I don't want to do repression work because I don't want to hurt people. I don't want people to get upset with me. And well, that's the repression talking. The repression ego seeks to avoid conflict. It seeks to avoid repercussions in relationship. So if you start to recognize there's repression and then you start listening to the voice that says, well, I don't want to do that work because I don't want to hurt people. I don't want people not to like me. That's that conditioning. That conditioning is never going to go do repression work fully. That conditioning is the thing that gets inquired into. Those thoughts that say, I don't want to hurt people, because that's what's kept you slow to anger and having volcanic eruptions. And you are hurting people, many of you. Even if you don't want to, by holding something in, you can damage a relationship. By erupting later, after you let something fester, there could be damage in a relationship. If you think that there's no damage in relationship from repressing, you're not paying attention. It can be very damaging because you authenticity isn't there. It just isn't there. So have you ever tried being in a relationship that's really inauthentic, where the partner cannot be real with you? And so they're putting on some front and you don't really see how they think or feel about something. And it's like pretense. That is not healthy any more than it would be if the person was going off in anger all the time. So you have to be careful of the conditioning that says, well, I don't want to do that work because I don't want people to attack me. I don't want people to not like me. That's the conditioning right there. Let's see what you guys have to say. Wow, a lot. Okay. The other thing I want to say is that a lot of our fears are not founded in fact. Like when the mind says, oh, I'm going to be out of control if I work on anger repression or fear repression or love repression or whatever, I'm going to be out of control. I'm going to be an asshole. And it just isn't happening that way. Because as you peel back the blocks to this, what feels like comes forth is love, like compassion and authenticity. What comes up is not, we don't find that we're all serial killers underneath. That would suck, but I don't see it. I don't see the out of controlness in people. In fact, people are reporting to me that as they embody the anger and no longer impress it, they feel more fully themselves and feel more authentic. So the fears of the ego are not real on this, is what I'll say. Yeah, you may get angry. For sure, anger may be more accessible to you, but that doesn't mean you're going to be out of control. And I just haven't seen that. Right, Caroline, I know what you mean. Like, I tend to overthink and think about it, not only before I would express something, but also after. So notice that, like, if you're able to muster some words out to someone, then watch what happens after when you judge yourself or feel ashamed of it, or like, I shouldn't have said that. And that reinforces the ego that will repress just by telling those stories after you express something. And then so it learns, like, the next time there's something to say, I'm not going to say it because I don't want to feel shame. See that? I don't want to feel shame again, so we learn not to do it. Each time we feel bad about it, it strengthens the thought I shouldn't do it because we're not doing repression work if we're not doing it. Yeah. Thank you, Serena. Okay, so that's good. Thank you. Um, can't read the name. Clemens? Houchard? Um, I tend to do the opposite, saying things without thinking, but I think that can be negative too. I think I'm trying to think over my response. Maybe that's one of the things that's is that there's programming both in the repressing and there's programming when we're just living and identified with anger. That's the point that I'm making. If we're just shooting off the mouth all the time, there could be things that we're believing about our reality that we're not inquiring into. So it feels like when people do work on both sides of the coin, like no longer repressing, not identifying with those thoughts, but also not identifying with the thoughts that come with the anger. It's just anger without hooking into the story of who's the anger happening to, or you see what I mean? Like, it's just anger. And then if it's not hooking into a deficiency story, then when you get angry, you're not going to be, oh, I did that, I'm bad, I did something wrong. See that? It's just going to be anger coming up and then falling away to no story around it. So I think that part of what's happening when we're just mouthing off in anger is, again, just identifying with something. Mm. You're right, Carolyn, needing to endure everything. That's where people get excited about this work, is because they've spent a lifetime of enduring these things and not saying anything. All kinds of relationships where you just endure. And then obligation. Can we talk about obligation for a second? When you don't speak your mind or your truth, you get pulled into obligation, obligatory things. Like you'll say yes to things that you don't want to do. Family, friends, because of not being able to speak up, which creates resentment and more anger, which then isn't expressed, and then more obligation, creating more anger, which isn't expressed. So the people that are doing this work, one of the great things about it is like they look at the horizon and they say it's actually possible to say no, and then that pulls them into the work because of the suffering that they've experienced and not being able to say no. It's okay to have a little bit of hope in the beginning of like you don't have to live that way anymore, even if it's still your experience that you're repressing. Knowing that you've seen it, you're aware of it, and you have tools now can create some hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. I felt so much grief, anger, and I let it all out, and now I feel joy. Exactly, I've been saying that on Facebook. When you repress one, you tend to repress another, all of us. And so as we lift one repression, strangely, other emotions and things become available to us, like in some weird way that I can't explain. Love, I can love deeper by being able to access anger, love more deeply. There's no way I could quantify that, but it seems to be about being authentic. When you're lying in a relationship and you're not showing parts of yourself, how can you really have a heart connection with that person? When you start showing the person all facets of yourself, let them see you fully. It's very connecting. It really is. It can be very connecting and very loving to see someone fully as they are and to have someone see you. It's also really scary. It can be, but incredibly liberating. And it does have an effect on love. It really does have an effect on relationships. If you would have told me that 5 years ago, that being more open to anger would bring a deeper sense of connection with the people in my life, the rational mind can't understand that. Our mind can't. I don't know about yours, but my experience shows me that that's the case. Oh gosh, let's just talk about joy repression for a second. I love this topic of the because what's available to us when we do this work. It has lit my experience on fire. Like I feel it through my whole body, the repression work of how it has freed up such stagnant energy and certain things in my relationship which were confusing, or my relationships which were confusing or stagnant have opened up. I don't know how to explain that, but communication opens up through this. Uh, Chester and I are communicating at a whole different level now because of this repression work. Yeah, super healthy, helpful. I love reading your comments. Uh, Hey Clemens, I think I'm in the area to say no to everything instead of yes. Too tight of boundaries. Never thought I would end on the other side of the spectrum. I sometimes feel like people get in my way. Say no to everything. There's some inquiry around that if you want it. Like, just when someone presents something to you where you feel the tendency to say no, just say, I can say yes to this, but only for the purpose of seeing the nature of your no. Like, if you say, I can say yes to this, it'll bring up fear or stories or programs that are connected to it, and you can just see them. So I can say yes to this, no, and watch and allow it all. That's a reverse inquiry. And then, so I'm not saying say yes to it. I'm saying do an inquiry that says, I can say yes to this as a reverse inquiry to pull up that. I'm not giving advice on whether to say yes or no to anything, but imagine how that would illuminate things for you, and so that whatever's operating for you wouldn't be doing it behind the scenes anymore. You can see it all. Yeah, so let's talk about joy repression. No, I'm going to get off of here and go to the restroom and come back and talk about joy repression. Since we're on the topic of repression, there's a few things I want to report about this as people start to do this work. And it's like the look in their eyes when they recognize that as they're doing as they're attending non-dual teachings, retreats, practices, flat. Their experience feels flat, and the joy isn't there. Let's talk about that in a second.